Good evening, dear friend. You're here now, and that's enough. The day, with all its noise and motion, has passed. Now comes the gentle hush that follows. A quieter rhythm begins. The rhythm of night. The rhythm of rest. I'm Duncan, born in the year 1592. Long before these city lights, long before these engines hummed, long before your world knew the names, it now whispers in dreams. And though time has moved on, I haven't. I've lived on, watched on, wandered through the centuries with open eyes and an open heart. Yes, I am immortal. And tonight, as I have on countless nights before, I've come simply to tell you a story. One from my long, quiet life. From the life of someone who has seen nearly everything and still finds wonder in a drifting fog. So before we begin, if you haven't yet, I kindly invite you to subscribe to this channel and to click the little bell so the next story can find you just when the world grows still again. And if you're still awake enough to reach for your screen, I'd love to hear from you. Tell me, what story would you like to hear next? And also, if you don't mind, when do you drift off to sleep? And in what part of the world does your night begin? Now, let go of the day. Let your body grow heavier. Let your thoughts float like steam on cool air. And come walk with me to a shoreline city where the fog is thicker than memory and silence paints the streets before dawn arrives. It was San Francisco. Early spring, though the trees seemed uncertain about blooming that year. I remember the dampness in the sleeves of my coat and how the salt in the air seemed to hang heavier than usual, as if the bay itself had been holding its breath. There is a kind of silence that only fog can bring. Not the absence of sound, but the softening of it. A streetcar bell somewhere far off, wrapped in wool. Footsteps that echo, but never arrive. And the gulls, fewer of them, quieter, drifting like punctuation marks in a sentence never spoken aloud. I had come to the embankment to walk. That was all. Just to walk. But as it happens in my life, and perhaps in yours too, some of the most meaningful encounters are those not sought. He was already there, leaning on the railing, looking not out at the water, but upward, toward nothing, really. The fog was so thick that even the skyline behind us was reduced to gesture. I noticed the satchel by his feet first, a leather one, worn at the edges, with brushes peeking out like dry grass. He was dressed plainly, but his coat had a streak of white pigment on the hem. And though he made no move and said nothing as I approached, there was a kind of quiet invitation in the way he stood. Like a museum you enter, not with tickets, but reverence. I remember asking gently, "Do you always paint in the fog?" He didn't look at me at first, but I remember the side of his face breaking into something between amusement and sadness. "I only paint in the fog," he said. Not, "I prefer it." Not, "It makes the city more beautiful." But only. Take a moment to absorb this. Not everyone seeks clarity. There are some hearts, some minds that do not want the world in sharp focus. They do not want the harsh contours of daylight or the neat frames of explanations. They want diffusion, ambiguity, the poetry of what is not quite visible. This man, whose name I would not learn for weeks, loved San Francisco not for its colors, but for its refusal to be pinned down. He told me that clarity was a form of aggression, that fog was the city's way of telling the world, "Not now." I asked him once if he had ever painted a sunny day. He said, "I did. Once. It looked dead." He saw fog not as obstruction, but as permission. Permission to feel without labels, to see without being certain, to create not what is, but what almost is, and in that almost, to reveal something more honest than precision ever could. As we stood together, barely speaking, I began to understand. The fog had a rhythm. It came in pulses, like breath. It erased things slowly, then gave them back slightly changed. It asked you not to rush, not to define too quickly. It offered mystery, and mystery, to some of us, is comfort. He painted not for galleries, he said, but for memory. He believed memory is fog-like, too, vague at the edges, clearer at the emotional center, and that we should not fear forgetting, only misunderstanding. Have you ever looked back at a moment in your life, a childhood window, a street you walked with someone you miss, a sound that used to be common and now is rare, and found it wrapped in a kind of internal mist? That's what he was painting. Not the place, not the time, but the quality of feeling as it dissipated. So many painters try to capture what is sharp. He tried to capture what is leaving. And there's a kind of peace in that. He once told me, "Clarity is for engineers. I paint for the ghosts." Now and then, a jogger would pass behind us, muffled in the morning hush. A delivery truck groaned in the distance, but none of it touched the place we stood. We had stepped outside the urgency of the world. The fog allowed it. Time moved differently there. And as I looked at his canvas, still nearly blank from where I stood, I thought about how rare it is to meet someone who has chosen not to define, but to suggest, to live not for answers, but for the hush before the answer forms. There's a certain freedom in loving the unclear, and I wonder if perhaps the path to peace isn't in learning how to see better, but in becoming more comfortable with the unseen. Just as the fog settles, so too does the mind. Not everything needs solving. Some things simply need softness. And so, we stood in the mist, two silhouettes suspended between sea and city. One of us eternal, the other painting what is meant to fade. Let's rest here for a moment. Let the image linger. Let your thoughts drift, not away, but inward. And when you're ready, I'll tell you about a man who sat by the water's edge each morning, never painting, but always writing, only in the early hours, before the world found its voice. Some days later, I returned to the same waterfront where I'd first encountered the painter. The fog was thinner that morning, just a whisper of silver around the edges of things, enough to make the air feel hushed, but not enough to hide the world completely. There was a man I'd seen there before, always seated at the far end of a wooden bench that faced the water directly. He wasn't part of the city's hurried rhythm. He moved slowly, purposefully, as if each motion was a choice, not a reflex. And always, without fail, he held a notebook. One of those thick bound types with yellowed pages and a stitched spine. His pen was a fountain, not a ballpoint. The ink shimmered faintly when the sun reached it. He never looked around, not even when dogs passed, or joggers huffed by, or delivery bikes rattled along the pavement. He sat, perfectly still, writing. But only in the mornings. I once passed by just after noon. The bench was empty. Another day, in the late afternoon, the same. I asked a florist nearby, who rolled up her cart around 10 each day, if she knew him. She smiled and said, "Only that he comes before the rest of us. By the time I'm setting up, he's nearly done." And so, I began to arrive earlier. On a morning when the fog kissed the edge of sunrise, I sat a few benches away and simply watched him work. He wrote without glancing up, without pausing to correct, as though he were transcribing something already whole. Eventually, I asked if I could join him. He said yes with a nod, though his hand didn't stop moving. It was several mornings before he ever spoke to me in full sentences. When he finally did, it was to answer the question I hadn't yet asked. "I only write in the mornings," he said, his voice soft but not shy. "I believe truth wakes early, before the noise returns." That line stayed with me. Truth wakes early. He had once been a novelist, though never a famous one. His books were out of print, he told me with a shrug, as though the act of publishing had never been the real point. Now he wrote only letters, but not to anyone in particular. He never mailed them. Each one began, "Dear you," and ended with initials that were not his. They were thoughts, confessions, questions. But mostly, they were moments. Moments captured just as they were, without polish or purpose, like shells picked up on a beach with no plan to keep them, only to marvel at them for a little while. I write before the day has formed an opinion, he told me once. Afterward, it's all too influenced, too aware of itself. But before 7, the page is still honest. He believed that every soul had its natural hour. Some people bloom at noon, some at dusk. But others, like him, were morning glow souls, who only ever find their truth when the world is quiet, and nothing yet expects anything from them. There's something beautiful in that idea, don't you think? That each of us carries a private clock, not bound by time zones, but by inner alignment. Perhaps you've felt it yourself, that subtle shift when the world is still asleep, and you sense deeply that this is your window. Your most real self emerges not under pressure, not under spotlight, but in the quiet unfolding of an unnoticed hour. The man on the bench said writing after 9 a.m. was like trying to hear a whisper in a crowd. Too much stimulus, too much identity. The thoughts were no longer his. They had already started performing for the day. But in the early haze of morning, when the fog still holds back the sound, and the city has not yet asked who you are, then the words come like steam off a mug, unforced, warm, vanishing as they rise, but real for the moment they exist. I asked if I could read one of his letters. He smiled gently. "No," he said. "They're not for reading. They're for writing." And I understood. Some things are not meant to be shared. They are written to keep one's own spirit whole, to arrange the furniture of the mind, to let the chaos breathe. His routine never changed. He would arrive before 6. He would write until his hand slowed, never more than 3 or 4 pages. Then he would close the notebook, wrap it in cloth, and disappear into the same cafe just beyond the corner. There's a reverence in that kind of discipline, not one made of rigidity, but of listening. He was listening to time itself, to what it allowed him to be, and honoring it with ink take a breath here. Let that idea rest beside you. You don't always have to produce. You don't have to publish, post, present. You can simply express only for you, only in your time. We live in an age of performance, but the man on the bench, he lived in the space before performance began. He told me once that the painter who stood by the fog-laced railing, yes, the one you already know, had once offered to draw his portrait. But he declined. "I'm more real in words," he said, "and only in the morning." Eventually, I stopped asking questions. We just sat. Two men of different centuries, both writing invisible things into invisible air. The fog began to lift around 7:30, and I could tell it was time. He folded his pages, tucked them away, and gave me the faintest nod. I returned it. He never said goodbye. But I remember one thing he once whispered, barely audible, just as the sun began to touch the tips of the buildings. Right before the fog burns away, truth hides in the mist. And I wonder how many truths in our own lives we miss because we wait until the world is wide awake. Let that settle inside you for a while. And when you're ready, I'll tell you about a painting, one that could only be seen properly when it was fogged over. A canvas that revealed its image only when the light dimmed and the moisture rose. The painter never called it a gallery. He said the word was too polished, too concerned with opinion and curation. He called it a room for waiting. And indeed, there was a stillness to the space, like it had been built not just to show art, but to host something sacred. A silence that you didn't interrupt with commentary, only breath. It was just a converted greenhouse tucked behind an old brick building, close enough to the waterfront that you could still smell the salt when the doors were open. Inside, there were only a few works. 3 canvases leaned like thoughts against the back wall. Another rested on an easel near a fogged window. But the one that drew your attention, the one that made you step slower as you approached, was housed in a glass case. At first, it seemed empty. A large canvas framed in driftwood, faint streaks of white and beige, maybe some pale blue smudges. Nothing coherent, nothing you could name. But beside it, there was a small wooden sign, hand-lettered in a gentle script. It read, "Step closer. Breathe, let the fog return." And when you did, when you moved nearer, the warmth of your body caused the glass to fog ever so slightly from within. The temperature difference triggered condensation, soft, slow, delicate. And as it bloomed across the glass, the image began to emerge, like a memory surfacing. The shapes were never sharp, but they were real. A shoreline, maybe. figures standing in mist, a city in the distance, but softened, like it was halfway between presence and absence. I remember the first time I saw it fully appear. There was a man near me, quiet, reverent, and as the image emerged, I saw his shoulders drop, not from disappointment, but from recognition. He whispered to no one in particular. That's what it felt like. Not what it looked like, not what it meant, but what it felt like. The painter had captured not the thing, but the experience of it. I asked him once, why the fog? Why hide the image until the air had shifted? He told me that some truths resist direct light. They only reveal themselves when conditions are right, when everything else is quiet, when the air is heavy and the heart is still. And that most of us, we don't walk around in clarity. We walk in moods, in fragments, in haze and glimmers. He wanted to make paintings that matched that, not to impose meaning, but to meet the viewer in the weather of their own heart. Let that linger for a moment. Not every truth needs to be broadcast. Not every beauty demands bright exposure. Some are only visible when we are willing to approach slowly, without demand. You've likely known someone like that. Someone whose presence is gentle, whose insights arrive like mist. You cannot force them into focus, but if you're still enough, they'll show you something unforgettable. I think we forget sometimes that revelation isn't always a lightning bolt. Sometimes it's fog over glass. Sometimes it's the gradual awareness that something has always been there. You just hadn't looked from the right temperature. I stood there a long while, watching the image appear, fade, and appear again. Each time slightly different, each time just as true. And it made me wonder how much of what we consider invisible is simply waiting for the right atmosphere. There are thoughts we can't grasp until we're tired, memories we can't face until we're calm, love we can't accept until we've unlearned the noise that tells us what it should look like. This painting, this fog-wrapped moment, wasn't just a trick of glass and air. It was a philosophy, a quiet argument against the tyranny of definition. It told me that what we see is not just about the object, but about who we are when we see it. The painter believed that art is not complete until it meets someone, and that the meeting is different each time. That's why he refused to frame his work behind fixed glass. He wanted the elements to participate, to remind the viewer that nothing is final and nothing is fully knowable. Some people found it frustrating. They wanted clarity, resolution. They wanted something to photograph. But I think those people were chasing permanence in a world that is, at its core, mist. The painter once said to me, "I don't make art to be remembered. I make it to remind someone, quietly, that forgetting is also beautiful." And perhaps that's true. Perhaps the best things in life don't stay sharp forever. They blur. They shift. They become soft at the edges. And in doing so, they take on the shape of the soul. Let that soften you a little. Let the tension ease in your hands, your jaw. Let yourself feel, not in detail, but in essence. You don't need to see everything clearly tonight. You only need to feel that something is there and trust that it matters. And so I stepped back from the fogged canvas. It faded again. It looked like nothing. But somehow I carried it with me. The image that only shows itself when you stop asking for it too loudly. Now, I'd like to tell you what happened one winter morning when I returned to the same bench where the writer used to sit, and found the fog not in the air, but in myself. A fog of feeling, the kind that doesn't pass through the city, but through the soul. Some days, the fog doesn't live in the sky at all. It moves through you. It settles behind the ribs. It fills the quiet corners of your chest and hums softly like a distant tide. You've felt it, I imagine. That subtle thickening of the world. That invisible weight that doesn't hurt but slows you. The fog of emotion, of memory, of knowing something's there, but not quite being able to name it. It was late winter when I returned to the embankment alone. The painter was gone, off to the coast of Oregon, I believe, to follow another kind of mist. The man with the notebook had vanished without farewell. The bench still stood, unchanged. But I had changed, not outwardly, but inwardly. There was a softness where certainty used to be, a pause where answers used to come quickly. I didn't mind it. In fact, I welcomed it. There's something strangely tender about emotional fog. It doesn't demand. It doesn't cry out. It just is, present, quiet, asking only to be noticed. That evening, I sat where the writer once did. I watched the outlines of ships dissolve into the gray. And as I did, I thought about how much of our inner life moves like mist, not with drama, but with drift. Some memories are not sharp. They return in weather, in music, in scent. You may not recall the words that were said, but you remember the temperature of the room, the light on someone's face, the silence just before they spoke. And isn't that fog too? Not absence, but gentle distortion. Not confusion, but protection. There's a reason so many poets write about mist. It's the metaphor we reach for when the feeling is too large or too quiet to describe. And I think there's a kind of wisdom in that. When I sat on that bench, I didn't try to push the fog away. I let it be. I let it stay. And in doing so, it began to speak, not in language, but in sensation. It reminded me of a moment from many years earlier, a rainy morning in Kyoto, standing beneath a paper umbrella, watching koi fish ripple through a pond as mist danced across the surface. I couldn't tell you why that memory returned just then, but it did, and with it, a softness. You see, fog doesn't erase. It reveals differently. It asks you to stop trying so hard to define. It invites you to feel your way forward. And in a world that so often insists on clarity, fog can feel like a mercy. Take a breath here. Not a deep breath, just a gentle one. Let it in without effort. Let it leave without force. Because that, too, is how fog moves. I've known people across decades, across continents, who carried fog inside them, not as burden, but as essence. They were not loud. They were not always understood, but they were present and deeply felt by those who stayed long enough to adjust their eyes. Perhaps you are like that, or perhaps you've loved someone who was. The kind of person you don't see fully all at once. The kind who appears in layers, not to hide, but because their truth is more weather than object. And when you meet such a person, or when you become one, you begin to realize that mystery is not something to solve. It is something to sit with. I once heard the painter describe fog as the world's way of whispering. And maybe the same could be said for emotion. It doesn't always arrive clearly. It isn't always easy to describe, but it's no less real. In fact, sometimes it's more honest than any spoken word. There, on that bench, wrapped in both outer and inner mist, I didn't come to any great revelation. There was no epiphany, just a quiet acceptance of being in between seasons, between people, between thoughts. That space, unrushed, undefined, is sacred. And I think we all need more of it. So, if you feel foggy tonight, not lost, just unclear, that's okay. Let the fog stay. Let it drift around you like a kind blanket. Let it hush the noise, because clarity will come. It always does. But for now, rest in the soft not knowing, the waiting, the gentle gray of becoming. And when you're ready, I'll tell you what happened when I returned to the painter's studio years later, long after he had gone. There, behind one of his oldest canvases, I found something I was never meant to read. A letter, left in silence, meant for no one, but found by me, and maybe meant for you too. Years passed. Seasons folded themselves into decades, and the painter's name faded from galleries and murmured circles of collectors. He never chased legacy. He never needed to. But when I returned to San Francisco sometime later, I learned that his old studio, the one by the bay with the fog-breathing windows, was to be emptied and archived. The building's owner, a quiet man who remembered me from foggier days, invited me to visit one last time. He said there were a few things left behind, and something told him I should be the one to see them. I arrived in the late afternoon, when the light is golden and low. Dust floated like forgotten thoughts in the air. The canvases were still there, leaning, sleeping. But there was one, older than the rest, that had been left face down. When I lifted it, something shifted. A whisper of paper sliding free. Behind the stretcher bars, wedged between wood and canvas, was an envelope, unmarked, unsealed, aged like parchment, fragile at the edges. And inside it, a letter, not addressed, not dated, just a few pages in the familiar handwriting of the man who had painted fog like it was language. He never meant for it to be read, but it was left in the world. And I believe the world has its own way of deciding what's meant to be found. The letter didn't explain anything. No confessions, no conclusions, just reflections, thoughts about the softness of uncertainty, about how fog had taught him to be gentle with truth, and how the act of creating, whether with brush or breath, was never about permanence. We do not make things to be seen forever, he wrote. We make them to hold what we felt before it fades. Take a moment to feel that. We make not to impress, but to remember, to honor what was fleeting, to wrap the fragile in something that might, just might, linger a little longer. I didn't take the letter. I left it there, tucked inside the old studio, beneath the dust, where silence could keep it company. But I walked away with its weight in me, not heavy, just present. It reminded me that not every story needs to end in revelation. Some simply end in reverence. And maybe, just maybe, you and I are the final brush strokes in someone else's unfinished painting, or the morning fog in a city they once loved. So now, as the night deepens, as your breath slows, and the stillness settles more fully into the room around you, I invite you softly to close your eyes if you haven't already. And if this journey brought you a little peace, a little quiet where the noise once lived, I would be glad if you subscribed to this channel and tapped the little bell so the next story can drift to you when the hour is gentle again. And if you feel like leaving me a message, I'd love to know what story you'd like to hear next. And also, when do you usually fall asleep? And in what time zone does your night begin? Every detail matters here, even the quiet ones, even yours. But for now, you don't need to think. You don't need to write. You don't need to remember. Just drift. Let the letter fold itself back into the silence. Let the painter return to mist. Let the fog come back in, and cover the rest of the world. You've wandered far enough for one evening. Rest well. Good night.